Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. One issue that should receive more attention in Australia and more attention in this House is the current situation in Iraq. As somebody who's followed the situation in Iraq very closely over the years and visited Iraq, particularly Baghdad and Erbil in 2017, I'm deeply dismayed at what we are observing in Iraq as we speak. Not only in Baghdad but around Iraq, protests are underway and have been continuing in Basra, in Najaf, in Karbala and in many Iraqi provinces. These protests are not new. They've been occurring for many years. What is new is the level of repression, Mr Speaker, that is occurring in Iraq and the level of violence that is occurring in Iraq. We have seen, Mr Speaker, 4,000 people injured and 100 people killed as a result of these protests in Iraq, and this is completely, of course, unacceptable, and friends of democracy anywhere in the world should be concerned about this, and friends of Iraq should be concerned about this. There is a campaign of intimidation and assault against activists. There is a campaign of repression, Mr Speaker, which is occurring. The demonstration started on the 1st of this month, on the one-year anniversary of President Adil Abdul Mahdi's government, and they have claimed the lives, as I said, of over 100 people. Now, I note that it has been denied that this violent activity has been ordered by the government, by the President. The question is, if the government hasn't ordered it, who has ordered this crackdown on democracy in Iraq? And this has caused grave concerns to the Iraqi community in Australia, and as a representative of many Iraqi Australians, I share those concerns and bring them to the attention of the House. On Friday last, I met with the Joint Committee of Iraqi Organisations in Australia, representing 23 different organisations in Iraq, covering a range of religions, ethnic groups, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Mandaeans, Kurds, and other representatives of the Iraqi community. They made the point that the violence does not discriminate, that people of all faiths have been impacted by the violence being perpetrated in Iraq, and that this has caused deep concern for the friends of Iraq and Iraqi Australians. Now, quite rightly, Mr Speaker, there's been a focus on events in Hong Kong, and I understand that and share that concern. But what we're seeing in Iraq, with 100 people killed, deserves the attention of the House as well. Australia, of course, played a role in the fall of Saddam Hussein, and therefore there is an ongoing interest and indeed an obligation on this House to take an interest in what has followed the fall of Saddam Hussein. And what we've seen in recent months is reminiscent of the Hussein regime. Two activists, Ali Jasseb el-Hattab and Maitam Mohammed Rahim el-Halal, have been forcibly disappeared. According to the relatives of el-Hattab, armed men in a black pickup truck dragged him away from his car, where he'd been to meet a client, and drove them away in one of his trucks. He has not been seen since. Again, this is reminiscent of previous days in Iraq, which Australia and other coalition partners combined forces to improve the situation in Iraq, but what we've seen is not an improvement in many senses. Now, the protests are set to resume on the 25th of October this week, after a religious observance period, which has seen the protests not proceed over recent days. And I'm deeply concerned, as I'm sure all honourable members would be, that when they do resume the protests, that the killing and the violence will be resumed as well. Now, the Australian government needs to make very strong representations to the government of Iraq that this sort of violent crackdown on protesters is not acceptable to us as a country which has a deep interest in Iraq and which is home to many Iraqi Australians. The Joint Committee of Iraqi Organisations has called for the identification of the offenders who shot civilians and justice for them, enforcing the law to prevent violation of human rights and to guarantee the rights of demonstration and restrict the ownership of arms within the Iraqi Defence Force, and respond to the demands of the demonstrators. These are reasonable requests on behalf of these Iraqi organisations, demands indeed, to the Iraqi government. Iraq is meant to be a democracy, and with democracy goes the right to protest without fear of your life and fear of violence, and that is not happening as we speak in Iraq. Right across Iraq, people are dying as they protest the actions of the government. Whether the government is right or wrong on policy, they are not right to engage in violence against Iraqi citizens, the situation is unacceptable.